The auctioneer's gavel rose high into the blazing Arizona sky, and the crowd that had gathered in the dusty center of Redemption Creek fell into a breathless silence. Cora Yates stood at the edge of the gathered townspeople, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white as bone. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like something desperate and caged, and she kept her chin raised because she refused, absolutely refused, to let a single one of these people see her break. The farm, her father's farm, the only thing left of him in this world, and they were selling it out from under her like it was nothing more than an old saddle or a rusted plow. Going to Mr. Gerald Hatch for the sum of $420, the auctioneer bellowed, his red face gleaming under the October sun. Do I hear any advance? 420, going once. Gerald Hatch stood at the front of the crowd with his thick thumbs hooked into his suspenders, grinning the kind of grin that belonged on a man who had already decided he had won. He was the richest landowner in Redemption Creek, and he had spent the last 2 months systematically purchasing every plot of struggling farmland between the creek and the foothills. The Yates farm was the last piece he needed to complete his empire, and he looked at Cora with an expression that was equal parts pity and contempt. Going twice. This farm has already been spoken for by me. The voice cut through the auction square like a rifle shot, low, certain, and carrying the kind of authority that made people instinctively stop moving. Every head in the crowd turned toward the source, and Cora felt the air rush out of her lungs as she turned with them. Deputy Joseph Donnelly stood at the edge of the wooden auction block, one boot planted on the bottom step, his broad shoulders squared under his dark vest, with the star pinned to it catching the afternoon light. He was not a man who shouted. He had never needed to. There was something in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his dark eyes that communicated perfectly clearly that he meant exactly every word he said and would not be moved from it. The auctioneer sputtered. "Now see here, deputy," I said, Joseph repeated, stepping fully onto the block and facing the crowd with a calm that seemed to make Gerald Hatch's grin flicker for the first time. "This farm has already been spoken for. By me. I placed my bid in writing with the bank 3 days ago, and I have the receipt right here." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, holding it up for the crowd, and then directly for the auctioneer's red and suddenly uncomfortable face. "I believe the bidding should have opened with my offer on record, not been concluded without it." The silence that followed was enormous. Cora could not move. She could not speak. She could only stare at the deputy who had just walked into the center of her worst nightmare and planted himself there like a man who fully intended to stay. It was 3 weeks earlier that everything in Cora Yates' life had begun to collapse, though if she were honest, the collapse had started long before that, quiet and invisible, the way the rot starts in a fence post well before anyone notices the wood has gone soft. Her father, Franklin Yates, had been the finest man she had ever known. He had come to Arizona Territory in 1871 with $60, a mule, and the kind of stubborn optimism that either kills a man or builds him something lasting. He had built something lasting. 40 acres of good creek-fed land, a proper farmhouse with a covered porch, a barn that had never leaked, and the kind of reputation in Redemption Creek that made men tip their hats when he rode by. Cora had grown up on that land, learned to ride on it, learned to work on it, and had expected to spend the rest of her life on it. Franklin died in July of 1883, 2 days after his 54th birthday, of a heart that had simply worked itself too hard for too many years. He went quickly, in his sleep, and Cora had held his hand in the morning and found it already cold, and was grateful at least that he had not suffered. What came after, though, had been a different kind of suffering altogether. The lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Purcell who smelled of tobacco and anxiety, had come to the farm the week after the burial. He had sat at her kitchen table with his papers spread out and told her, with the tone of a man delivering news he very much did not want to deliver, that Franklin Yates had been carrying a mortgage against the farm for the last 4 years. The bank held a note for $380. The note was due in full within 90 days of his passing, per the specific terms Franklin had agreed to. Cora had not known. Franklin had never told her. She understood, sitting across from Purcell with her hands flat on her kitchen table, that her father had not told her because he had intended to pay it off himself, had probably believed right up until the end that he would manage it, and had not wanted her to worry. It was such a perfectly Franklin Yates thing to do that it almost made her smile, except that the result was that she was sitting alone in her kitchen staring at a debt she could not possibly pay. She had tried. In the weeks that followed, she had tried every avenue available to her. She had written to her mother's cousin in Tucson, who had written back with genuine regret and an explanation of his own financial difficulties. She had gone to the bank and spoken to the manager, a compact, precise man named Aldridge, who had expressed sympathy while making absolutely clear that the terms of the note were not negotiable, and that the bank's obligations to its own investors made flexibility impossible. She had looked into selling a portion of the land, but the moment word got out about her situation, the only serious offer came from Gerald Hatch, who had offered her $150 for the whole 40 acres, a sum that was not just insulting, but was practically a declaration that he intended to steal it. She had turned him down flat, looked him in his florid face, and told him she would find another way. He had smiled at her like a man who already knew she would not. The notice of auction had been posted on the 1st of October. Cora had stood in front of the bank's notice board and read her own farm's description printed on a piece of paper and had felt something in her chest turn to stone. She had $92 in savings, the product of years of careful keeping. She had her father's horse, worth perhaps $30. She had her pride, which was worth a great deal to her personally and precisely nothing at auction. She had been making her way back across the main street of Redemption Creek, her chin up and her eyes dry because she was not going to cry where anyone could see her, when she had walked directly into Deputy Joseph Donnelly. Not figuratively, literally. She had come around the corner of the general store without looking and had walked straight into his chest, which was broad and solid enough that the collision had sent her staggering backward a half step, and he had caught her elbow without thinking, and she had looked up into a pair of dark eyes that were already examining her face with an expression of immediate concern. "Miss Yates," he said, "are you all right?" She knew who he was. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Deputy Donnelly. He had come to town 2 years ago with Sheriff Alcott, who had brought him in specifically to help manage the growing trouble along the southern cattle routes. He was 31 years old, she believed, though he sometimes seemed older in the way that men with heavy responsibilities sometimes do. He had the kind of face that was not immediately handsome, but became so the longer you looked at it. Strong jaw, straight nose, those steady dark eyes that seemed to miss very little. He was not one of the men who gathered at the saloon and made noise about their own importance. He was one of the men who actually did things, quietly and without fanfare, and Redemption Creek was a safer and better-ordered place for his presence in it. "I am perfectly fine," she had told him, and taken her elbow back in a way that was perhaps more abrupt than was warranted, because she was not fine at all, and she did not want him to see it. He had let her take her elbow back without comment, but he had not moved to step around her and go on his way. He had looked at her with those careful eyes and said, "I saw the notice on the board." She had not known what to say to that, so she had said nothing. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "He was a good man." "He was the best man I have ever known," she had said, with a flatness in her voice that came from having said it too many times in the past weeks to people who meant well and could not help. "Is there anything to be done?" he had asked, not in the manner of a man making small talk, but in the manner of a man who was genuinely asking because he wanted to know if there was a problem that could be solved. "Not unless you have $380 in your vest pocket," she said, and it came out harder than she meant it to, and she saw the slight shift in his expression that said he understood she was not being cruel on purpose. She was just at the end of something. "Not today," he said simply. She had nodded, excused herself, and walked home. She had cried that night, alone in the farmhouse with the windows dark and the October wind coming in cold off the desert, but she had cried quietly, and she had been done with it by morning. She had not expected to hear from Joseph Donnelly again. Or rather, she had expected the same polite nothing that she had received from everyone else. The sympathetic looks, the occasional casserole left on her porch, the general community sadness that managed to coexist quite comfortably, with no one actually doing anything to help. He had come to the farm 4 days after their collision outside the general store. He had come in the evening just before dark, and he had knocked at her door with his hat in his hands, and when she opened it he had said without preamble, "I want to talk to you about the farm if you'll allow it." She had allowed it. Partly because she was past the point of refusing any conversation that might contain a solution, and partly because there was something in the way he spoke direct and unadorned, without the artificial softness that men often adopted when speaking to women in difficult circumstances, as though difficulty somehow reduced a woman's capacity for plain information, that she found she trusted instinctively. He had sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Purcell had laid out her father's papers, and he had placed his hat on the chair beside him and looked at her across the table and said, "I've been thinking about your situation." "So have I," she said. "Thinking has not produced a solution." "I have $400 saved," he said. She had gone very still. "It's every cent I've put by in 2 years of this job," he continued, in the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to give her the weather forecast. "It would cover the mortgage and give you enough left over to see you through winter. I'd like to offer it to you as a loan." Cora had looked at him for a long moment. She was 26 years old, and she had dealt with enough men in her life to know what usually came attached to the word offer when it came from a man's mouth. "Why?" she asked. "Because the farm ought to stay in your hands," he said. "And because Gerald Hatch getting his hands on another 40 acres of Good Creek land is not something this town can afford, even if most of them haven't worked that out yet." "Those are practical reasons," she said carefully. "Is that all they are?" He met her eyes. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know you exist, Miss Yates, but I'm also not going to insult you by attaching conditions to help that ought to be offered without them. It's a loan. You pay it back when you can, that's the whole of it." She had wanted to say yes immediately. The relief that the offer produced was so intense it was nearly physical, but she had spent 26 years learning to think carefully about things that seemed too simple, and she forced herself to do it now. "You said $400, she said. "The bank wants $380. And you'll need supplies for winter. Feed, flour, lamp oil." "I looked at your outbuildings yesterday," he stopped, and she could see the slight hesitation that said he knew he'd revealed something. "From the road," he added. "Your fence along the north pasture needs work before the cold weather sets in, and that costs money too." She almost smiled. She did not quite, but it was close. "You looked at my outbuildings from the road. The north pasture fence is visible from the road." "So it is." She had looked down at her hands on the table, then back up at him. "Deputy Donnelly, I don't know how to accept charity." "Then don't," he said. "It's a loan." She had thought about it through an entire night, and most of the following morning, turning it over and examining it from every angle that suspicion and pride could suggest. By afternoon she had concluded that the offer was exactly what it appeared to be, which was a rare and remarkable thing in her experience, and she had gone into town and told him she would accept, with the terms of repayment to be agreed upon in writing. He had not smiled like a man who had gotten what he wanted. He had simply nodded and said they would go to the bank together the following morning. What neither of them had known was that Gerald Hatch had already been moving pieces on a board they couldn't see. Hatch had a relationship with the bank manager Aldridge that went back years and involved considerations that were not documented in any ledger. On the same evening that Cora had agreed to Joseph's loan, Hatch had sat in Aldridge's office and made certain arrangements. By the following morning, when Joseph and Cora appeared at the bank, Aldridge had informed them that the note had already been declared in default the previous afternoon, by his calculation, 1 day earlier than the 90-day term actually required, and that the property was already scheduled for public auction per the bank's standing policy on defaulted mortgages. The look on Joseph's face in that bank office had been the first time Cora had seen something other than steadiness behind his eyes. It had been cold. Not angry in the way of a man who loses his temper, but angry in the way of a man who has recognized a specific kind of wrong and has begun calculating the appropriate response. He had looked at Aldridge and said, very quietly, "You've made a bookkeeping error." Aldridge had straightened his cuffs and said the determination had been reviewed and was final. Joseph had then said that he would be filing a formal written objection with the Territorial Land Office, and that he suspected the process of reviewing that objection would take considerably longer than the auction was scheduled to occur. Aldridge had gone a little pale, but had said the auction would proceed. Cora had walked out of the bank with the controlled composure of a woman who had decided that if she did not control herself, she would do something that would get her arrested, and Joseph had walked beside her and said nothing for half a block, and then said, "I'm not done." "I didn't think you were," she had said, and had surprised herself by meaning it completely. He had spent the next 5 days working every legal angle available to him. He had written the Territorial Land Office. He had consulted with a lawyer in Tucson via telegraph. He had reviewed the bank's own posted terms and conditions, with the attention of a man reading a document for hidden traps, which was exactly what he was doing. He had found 2 procedural irregularities in the way the default had been declared, neither of them definitive on their own, but both together constituting at minimum a credible argument. He had also, in those 5 days, had 3 conversations with Cora that had nothing to do with the bank or the farm or Gerald Hatch. Conversations that had begun as updates on his legal inquiries and had somehow extended past the useful information into other territory entirely. He had told her about growing up in Missouri, the second of 4 brothers, his father a blacksmith who believed that a man ought to know how every tool he used had been made. She had told him about learning to ride at age 7, her father putting her on a horse that was perhaps slightly too large for a 7-year-old, and standing back to see what she did, which turned out to be ride it perfectly well, because the Yates' stubbornness was apparently heritable. On the 4th evening he had come to the farm again, and they had sat on the covered porch in the cooling dark, and she had served him coffee, and they had talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with foreclosures or injustice or the machinations of Gerald Hatch. And at the end of it, he had stood to leave and had looked at her for a moment in the lantern light from the doorway. And she had thought, she had been almost certain, that he was going to say something that was not about the farm at all. He had said, "I'll have news for you tomorrow, I think, one way or another." "All right," she had said, and watched him walk back down the path to the road, and had stood on the porch in the dark for a long time after he was gone. The news the next day had been that every avenue he had found was either too slow or too fragile to stop the auction, which Hatch had managed to accelerate through Aldridge's cooperation. The auction was set for the coming Thursday. Joseph had looked at her across his desk in the deputy's office, and there had been something in his face that was closer to apology than she had ever seen on him, and she had said, "You've done everything you could," and had meant it. What she had not known, what he had not told her, was that he was not done. He had spent that night making one more calculation, quiet and alone, and he had arrived at a number and a plan that was simultaneously the most straightforward thing he had ever done and the most consequential. The farm's opening bid was set at $420. Gerald Hatch's actual intent was to run the bidding only as high as necessary to secure the property, counting on the fact that no one in Redemption Creek had either the money or the nerve to outbid him on a property he had already publicly declared his interest in. He had made it socially and professionally clear that opposition to his purchases was unwelcome, and 2 of the farmers who had initially resisted had subsequently found their own financial circumstances becoming surprisingly difficult. Joseph had put every cent of his savings, the $400 he had originally offered Cora as a loan, into a sealed bid registered formally with the bank 3 days before the auction. He had not told Cora. He had not told the sheriff. He had filed the paperwork, gotten the receipt, and gone about his regular duties, waiting. He had watched Cora in the crowd on auction day from across the square before he moved. He had seen the way she held herself straight-backed, chin up. That particular stillness that he had come to understand was the form her courage took when she was most afraid. He had seen Hatch at the front of the crowd, grinning. He had seen the auctioneer raise his gavel, and then he had walked to the auction block and said what he said, and the world had gone quiet. The aftermath of that moment happened in rapid and disorderly stages. The auctioneer examined the receipt Joseph produced and went the color of old flour. Gerald Hatch pushed through the crowd with his large face arranged into an expression of controlled fury and demanded to see the document himself. Joseph handed it over with the patience of a man who has prepared for exactly this moment. Hatch read it, read it again, and then looked up at Joseph with eyes that had gone small and hard. "This is irregular," Hatch said. "The bank's own procedures allow sealed prior bids to be entered up to 72 hours before a scheduled auction," Joseph said. "I filed mine 71 hours ago. It is entirely regular." Aldridge said nothing about any sealed bid. Aldridge may not have considered it his obligation to keep you personally informed of the bank's other business. Joseph's voice remained even and unhurried, though you might want to examine why you expected him to. That last sentence landed in the crowd like a stone in still water, and Cora, watching from where she stood, saw several people's expressions shift as they absorbed what the deputy was implying. Hatch turned to Aldridge, who had appeared at the edge of the auction area looking like a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere else. "Is this legal?" he demanded. Aldridge looked at the receipt, then at Joseph, then at Hatch, and finally, with the expression of a man who has just determined which way the wind is blowing and adjusted accordingly, said, "The procedure appears to have been followed correctly." The silence that followed was long. "Then I'll raise the bid," Hatch said. 450. "The auction was declared closed," the auctioneer said, his voice slightly unsteady. "The prior sealed bid was the highest registered offer at the time the gavel fell. Once the auction is declared closed, you hadn't finished declaring it," Hatch snapped. "Going once, going twice," said old Patterson, who had been standing nearby and apparently felt the citizen side of this argument needed a voice. He had a gift for stating the obvious with perfect timing. There was a ripple of laughter in the crowd, nervous and brief, but enough to shift the balance of the moment. Hatch turned from Aldridge to Joseph, and what was in his eyes now was not fury but something colder and more considered. "You can't afford this farm, Donnelly. A deputy's pay doesn't cover $400. "My finances are my own concern," Joseph said. "You did this for her." Hatch's eyes moved to Cora and his voice took on an uglier tone. "You've spent your whole savings on some foolish sentiment." Joseph looked at him for a moment. "I've purchased a farm," he said. "At a fair price through a legal process. That's the whole story, Mr. Hatch." It was not, of course, the whole story, but it was all of it that Hatch was going to get. The auctioneer, apparently deciding that the path of least institutional damage was to complete the transaction as Joseph had presented it, formally recorded the sale and handed Joseph a receipt. Hatch stood in the middle of the square with his large hands making and unmaking fists at his sides, and then he turned and walked away without another word. The crowd parting for him in the automatic way they parted for anything large and moving with bad intention. Cora stood where she was until most of the crowd had dispersed, because she needed a moment to make sure her legs were going to work properly. Then she walked across the square to where Joseph was folding his papers back into his vest pocket, and she stopped in front of him and she looked at him, and she said nothing for what felt like a very long time. He looked back at her and waited because he was a man who understood the value of waiting. You spent everything you had, she said finally. I spent my savings, he said, which is a thing savings are for. Joseph. It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard herself do it and did not take it back. That was everything. 2 years of, it was the right use of it, he said simply. I'd have been irritated to find another use for it. She looked at him, really looked at him, in the way she had been carefully not doing for the past 2 weeks because she was afraid of what she might find if she looked too directly. She found exactly what she had been afraid of finding, which was a man she was already trusting with things she had never trusted to anyone, and the understanding that the trust was not misplaced, and that this was both wonderful and enormously terrifying. The farm is yours now, she said. I'll need a plan for it, he said, and something in his voice was quieter than it had been a moment ago, less formal, and his eyes had not moved from hers. That's a conversation I'd like to have with you if you're willing to have it. What kind of conversation? She asked, though she suspected she knew. The kind where we work out what this looks like going forward, he said, for the farm, and for he stopped, picked up again, for everything else. The October wind moved between them, carrying dust and the smell of distant rain, and Cora made a decision. Come to dinner tonight, she said. We'll talk then. He had nodded, and she had walked home, and she had stood in her kitchen for 5 minutes doing nothing but breathing before she was capable of thinking clearly enough to begin cooking. The dinner was both simple and somehow monumental. She made the kind of food her father had liked: beef stew with biscuits, the biscuits from a recipe her mother had left her, the beef from the last portion of the animal she had butchered in September. She had laid the table properly, which she had not done since her father died, with the blue-edged plates that had been her mother's good china. Joseph arrived at the farm in the last light of the evening, and she opened the door before he could knock because she had heard his horse on the path. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the table and then at her, and said, "It smells remarkable." "Sit down," she said, because she did not know what else to do with the particular feeling that was happening in her chest. They ate, and the conversation ranged widely: his work, the town, the territorial politics that were slowly reshaping Arizona, her memories of growing up on the farm, his time before Arizona. He had been a deputy in 2 other towns before this one, he told her. He had seen enough of dishonest sheriffs and purchased judges in those places to develop a very firm opinion about what justice ought to look like in practice. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. "To find somewhere the law still meant something?" "Partly," he said. "Sheriff Alcott is a straight man." "That matters. And the other part?" she asked. He looked at her across the table with the blue-edged plates between them and said, "I suppose I was looking for something I couldn't quite name. I've lived a long time in transit, moving between one place and the next. I thought maybe I'd find somewhere worth staying." "And have you?" she asked. "I think I'm beginning to," he said. The words sat in the room for a moment. The lantern between them threw warm light across the table and across his face, and Cora thought about the farm outside in the dark, her father's farm, still standing, still hers in every way that mattered because of the man sitting across her table, and she felt something that was simultaneously enormous and extraordinarily quiet. "I want to work out the repayment," she said. He nodded. "We can do that." "Properly," she said. "In writing, with a schedule." "Of course," he said, and there was the smallest suggestion of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I wouldn't expect anything else from you, Miss Yates." "Cora," she said, "if we're going to argue about repayment schedules, we ought to be on first-name terms." "Cora," he said, and the way he said it carefully, like a word he intended to say a great many more times, made her look down at her biscuit for a moment, until she was sure her face was behaving properly. They did work out the repayment, sitting at the table after the dishes were cleared, with paper and pencil between them. She insisted on a real rate of interest, small but real, because she was not going to accept charity dressed as a business arrangement. He accepted the interest without argument. They settled on terms, a portion each harvest season for the next 3 years, and she wrote them out and they both signed, and he folded his copy and put it in his pocket. Then they had sat in a momentary silence that was not uncomfortable, but was full of the awareness of things not yet said. "I need to tell you something," Joseph said. She looked at him. "I didn't just file that bid because it was the right practical solution," he said. "I could have presented you with the money again as a loan, tried to work out the auction from a different angle. I chose the specific method I chose partly for legal reasons and partly because," he stopped. His jaw worked once. He was not, she realized, a man who found this kind of directness easy, even though he was generally direct about everything else. "Because I wanted to have a stake in this farm, something concrete, not as a claim on you, as a reason to be here, as something that meant I had a reason to stay." The room was very quiet. "That is the most complicated way I have ever heard a person say they wanted to stay somewhere," she said. He looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He laughed. Not a polite social laugh, but a genuine one, surprised out of him, and it entirely transformed his face, and she found herself laughing too, the first real laughter she had produced in months. And for a moment they were just two people laughing in a kitchen in the October dark, which was perhaps the best thing she had felt since July. When it settled, he was looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she suspected he did not allow very often, and she looked back at him without looking away, and she said, "I'm glad you're here, Joseph." "So am I," he said. He left an hour later. She stood on the porch and watched him go, and the night was full of stars and the smell of coming rain, and she thought about hidden motives and forced choices and dark pasts, and she thought that sometimes what looked like those things was actually just a good man doing a brave thing, and that the courage to distinguish between the two was its own kind of gift. November came in cold and immediately full of difficulty. Gerald Hatch, denied the Yates farm by Joseph's intervention, did what men of his particular type invariably did when directly opposed. He expanded his methods. Within 2 weeks of the auction, 3 separate incidents occurred on properties adjacent to Cora's farm. A fence was cut. A water diversion was blocked with debris that looked accidental and wasn't. A neighboring farmer named Elias Burkett found 3 of his cows dead in a ravine under circumstances that were suspicious enough that he came to the deputy's office in a state of barely controlled rage. Joseph listened to all 3 reports with careful attention and said very little, but Cora could see, when she came to town and saw his face, that he was building something in his mind, a map of Hatch's movements and methods, a picture of the pattern. She came to the deputy's office on a Wednesday afternoon with cornbread wrapped in cloth, which was a transparent excuse and both of them knew it, and he accepted the cornbread with the gravity it deserved and moved a stack of papers so she could sit in the chair across from his desk, and she said, "Tell me what he's doing." "Applying pressure to the perimeter," Joseph said. "He can't have your farm directly, so he's making the surrounding land too expensive and difficult to hold. If enough of your neighbors sell, your 40 acres becomes isolated and loses most of its practical value. And then he comes for mine again," she said. "Eventually," he said. "Yes. What are you going to do?" "I'm already doing it," he said. "Every incident gets documented formally with witness statements. If there's a pattern visible in the documents, it becomes the kind of evidence that interests the territorial marshal's office. Hatch has stayed legal enough that local law can't move against him directly. The territorial level is another matter." She looked at him across the desk with its stacks of papers and its battered lamp, and she thought about how much work he had put into this, not just the farm purchase, but all of this careful, deliberate documentation, the letters, the witness statements, the map he was building one piece at a time. "You've been doing this for weeks," she said. "Since the auction," he said, "while also doing your actual job." "This is part of my actual job," he said, with a slight edge that she recognized as the specific kind of firmness he applied to things he felt strongly about. "What Hatch is doing to this town is the kind of thing this job exists to address. I'm not going outside my authority. I'm using it." She looked at him for a moment. "You're a good deputy," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said, which was somehow more affecting than confidence would have been. The cornbread was consumed between them with coffee, and the conversation drifted, and she told him about the repairs she was making to the north fence, and he told her about a horse he'd had in Missouri as a boy that had the distinct personality of an animal that felt it was operating above its station, and she laughed again, and he smiled, and the afternoon passed. It was on her way home that she allowed herself to fully acknowledge what had been building between them, or more accurately, what had already built itself entirely without asking her permission. She was in love with Joseph Donnelly. She had probably been moving in that direction since the moment he had stood at that auction block, and said those words with a conviction so absolute it had stopped the crowd cold, and the direction had become a destination somewhere around the third evening on her porch, and had become a certainty over cornbread and coffee this afternoon. She was in love with him, and she was not at all sure what to do with that information given that they had a formal loan agreement between them with a repayment schedule and interest. She was going to have to think about this very carefully. As it happened, Joseph had been doing his own thinking, and his thinking was characteristically more direct. He came to the farm the following Sunday, which she knew because she had learned his habits well enough to know he was not usually in the field on Sundays. He came in the early afternoon when the winter light was thin and bright, and she was on the porch with a mending basket when she saw him coming down the road on his bay horse, and she set the basket aside and stood up and waited. He tied the horse at the post and came up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was not wearing his deputy's vest. He was in a plain dark coat, and his hat was his everyday one, and without the star on his chest he looked somehow younger and more uncertain, which she found unexpectedly moving. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly without talking around it because I think you deserve that." "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for," he paused, calculating, "several weeks, I think. But it became undeniable approximately 2 Wednesdays ago over your cornbread, which I want you to know is an excellent legacy for a piece of cornbread." Cora stood on her porch and looked at this man who was standing on her front path holding his hat and telling her, in the most direct possible terms, the most important and terrifying thing a person can tell another person, and she thought, this is what brave looks like when it's applied to love. "I have the same problem," she said. He looked up at her sharply. "I am also in love with you," she said. "Which I have been trying to reason my way out of for approximately 3 weeks, because we have a formal loan agreement with a repayment schedule between us, and I was not sure that was a complication that could be navigated." "It can be navigated," he said. "I've come to that conclusion too," she said. He came up the porch steps then, and she did not step back, and he stopped close enough that she could see every line of his face in the thin winter light, and he said, "May I?" and she said, "Yes," before he could finish, because she had been patient long enough with her own wanting, and he kissed her, careful at first and then not careful at all, and the November wind came around the corner of the farmhouse and neither of them noticed. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and most beautiful period of Cora's adult life. The two conditions being, she was discovering, not as contradictory as she had always assumed. The complication was Hatch, who was becoming more aggressive in ways that were harder to document. His men, and it was widely understood but difficult to legally establish that they were his men, had been seen at several points along the creek in the pre-dawn hours, doing things that were difficult to see clearly in the dark and impossible to prove in daylight. Joseph was collecting every scrap of evidence with the patience of a man who has decided that patience is his most effective weapon, and Cora respected that approach entirely, while also being aware that it required the capacity to wait, and waiting was not something she had ever found easy. The beauty was Joseph himself, and the thing that was growing between them, which had the quality of something that had been going to happen from a certain point forward, and had simply been waiting for them to catch up to it. He came to the farm regularly now, openly, and the town of Redemption Creek observed this development with the intensity that small towns bring to any shift in their members' personal circumstances. There was gossip. Most of it was positive, because Cora was well-liked and Joseph was respected, and the combination of those facts produced a general community sentiment that ranged from approval to delighted vicarious satisfaction, depending on whom you asked. Mrs. Alcott, the sheriff's wife, buttonholed Cora outside the dry goods store and said with the directness of a woman who had long since dispensed with social circumlocutions, "About time that man found something to stay for," and walked away without waiting for a response, which Cora thought was probably just as well because she would not have known what to say. Joseph had told her, one evening in December when they were sitting by her fireplace with a frost settling outside, about his previous life in a way he had not before. He had been engaged once in Missouri to a woman named Ellen who had been sweet and patient and entirely unprepared for the reality of what life with a man in law enforcement actually looked like. He had known, even before she had found the words for it, that she needed something steadier and simpler than he could give her. They had parted without drama and without hatred, and she had eventually married a schoolteacher, and Joseph had moved west with the clarity of a man who has understood something important about himself. "What did you understand?" Cora asked. "That I needed a woman who didn't require me to be something else," he said. "Not a specific thing. Just not different from what I am." She considered this. "What you are," she said carefully, "is a man who spends his savings on other people's farms and then documents evidence for weeks in order to build an airtight legal case against a powerful enemy using nothing but official procedure and obstinate patience. That is a very specific description of what I am," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. He looked at her in the firelight, and the expression on his face was the one she loved best, the one that was not guarded at all, that was simply present, simply his. "I've noticed," he said. "I don't need you to be different," she told him. "I know," he said. "That's the thing." December deepened. The farm work continued. There was always farm work, winter notwithstanding, and Joseph helped when he was there, and she managed expertly when he was not, which was a distribution of labor she found entirely satisfactory. He was not the kind of man who helped and then expected gratitude for it. He helped and then moved on to the next task, as though helping were simply what was done when something needed doing. On the 21st of December, two things happened. The first was that Joseph received a communication from the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson. The documentation he had been building over the past 2 months, the incident reports, the witness statements, the pattern of interference with neighboring properties, had reached the threshold the Marshal's office required to open a formal investigation into Gerald Hatch's business practices and their potential violations of territorial law. An investigator would be arriving in Redemption Creek in January. The second was that Gerald Hatch's foreman, a large, unpleasant man named Sutter, appeared at the Yates farm in the late afternoon with 3 other men and told Cora that Mr. Hatch was prepared to offer her $500 for the farm, and she would be well advised to accept it. The implication of what happened to people who were not well advised left unsaid, but thoroughly present in the way he stood, and the way the 3 men with him stood. Cora looked at Sutter across the threshold of her front door and said, "This property belongs to Deputy Donnelly. You'll need to take any offers to him." Sutter said that she was the one living on the land and she was the one Hatch was speaking to. "Then he's speaking to the wrong person," Cora said, "and he is also trespassing on private property, which I am asking you to vacate immediately." Sutter's face went through several expressions. He was not accustomed to women speaking to him this way. He was particularly not accustomed to women speaking to him this way while standing in an open doorway with the calm of a person who is not afraid, or at any rate is not going to show that they are afraid, which is close enough to the same thing to make no practical difference. He left. She closed the door and held very still for a moment, and then she walked to her desk and wrote a note and sent it to town with her neighbor's boy. And by the time Joseph arrived at the farm an hour later, she had already calmed herself down enough to report the incident in the flat, factual manner that she knew he would find most useful. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said. "They're getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes." "They do," he said, and there was a dark satisfaction in his voice. "And this is now documented as the latest in a series, which means the marshal's case just got considerably stronger." "I thought it might," she said, "which is partly why I'm telling you in that order." He looked at her across the kitchen, and the look had in it a very specific kind of recognition, of the way she thought, the way she handled things, the way she was constitutionally incapable of letting fear do her thinking for her. And it had in it something else too, something warmer and more foundational. And he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then her temple, and then her mouth. And she put her hands flat against his chest, and felt the steady beating of his heart, and thought that this was what safety felt like when it was not an absence of danger, but a presence of something solid. January arrived with the territorial investigator, a spare, careful man named Hargreaves, who had the eyes of a person who had been looking at dishonesty professionally for long enough that he could identify it from considerable distance. He spent 2 weeks in Redemption Creek, reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, examining Hatch's land acquisition records with the attention they had never received from the county clerk, who had been processing them with perhaps excessive incuriosity for the past 3 years. Joseph cooperated with the investigation fully and systematically, providing every document he had built over the past months. Cora provided her own account of the auction and its aftermath, formally and without embellishment, in Hargreaves's temporary office at the hotel. At the end of January, Hargreaves presented his findings. Gerald Hatch was formally charged with collusion with a bank officer, Aldridge, who had his own accounting to do, unlawful interference with agricultural property rights, and 2 counts of fraudulent acceleration of mortgage default proceedings, which was the exact technical description of what he had done to Cora's father's farm. The charges were real and the evidence was solid, and the territorial court would take months to work through the process. But the immediate effect was that Hatch's capacity to operate in Redemption Creek was instantly and substantially reduced. His legal difficulties were significant enough that his own creditors began to look at him differently, and 2 banks that had been extending him operating credit withdrew their support while the investigation was pending, and the empire he had been building crumbled at its foundations with a speed that was almost satisfying to watch. Aldridge was removed from his position at the bank. The new manager, a careful young man named Collins who had come from Phoenix and had no prior relationship with Hatch, reviewed the Yates mortgage situation and determined, based on the documentation Joseph and Cora provided, that the default declaration had been procedurally improper. While the property was legally Joseph's by purchase, Collins formally cleared the original mortgage record and issued Cora a letter stating that the farm had not been in legitimate default at the time of the auction. It was a legal refinement that did not change the practical situation but mattered enormously in principle, and Cora accepted the letter and held it for a moment in Collins's office and felt her father's absence with a sharpness she hadn't expected. She thought of him building this farm with $60 and a mule, and she thought that if he had known how it would go, if he had known what it had come to and who had stood up in the town square and said what had needed saying, he would have approved. Franklin Yates had always been a reliable judge of men. February brought a cold snap that drove the temperature below freezing for 2 weeks and kept the whole territory hunkered down and internal. Joseph spent as much time at the farm as his duties allowed, which was more than either of them had expected given that the reduction in Hatch's activities had significantly decreased the level of active law enforcement complexity in the county. They worked on the farm together during those frozen days, repairing things, organizing things, planning the spring planting with the practicality of people who are going to be here for it. It was during one of those planning sessions, sitting at the kitchen table with seed catalogs and her father's old planting records spread between them, that Joseph said, without looking up from the catalog, "I'd like to marry you, Cora." She looked up from the planting record she was comparing. He was still looking at the catalog. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked up then. "Would you like to marry me?" "That's still not quite right," she said. "You're asking it like a logistical matter." He put the catalog down. "Cora," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my 31 years of living, and I love you with a totality that I find both clarifying and slightly overwhelming, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life on this farm and in this county, and in whatever other places life takes us, doing all of it alongside you, and I would like that arrangement to be made official and permanent in every way available to us. Will you marry me?" The morning light came through the kitchen window across the seed catalogs and the old planting records and the coffee cups between them, and Cora Yates looked at Joseph Donnelly across her father's table in her father's kitchen on her father's farm, which was also now in its way his farm, and was in every way the place where she intended to live her entire life, and she said, "Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was warm and certain, and she turned her hand over and held his back. They were married in March, in the Redemption Creek Church, on a morning that could not seem to decide between winter and spring and alternated between the two every half hour, producing a ceremony that took place in thin gold sunlight, paused briefly for a sharp shower, and concluded in sunlight again. The whole town came, or close to it, because Redemption Creek was the kind of place where weddings were a community event regardless of whether you'd been personally invited, and the collective emotional investment in this particular wedding was high. Sheriff Alcott stood up with Joseph, being the person Joseph had most consistently trusted in Redemption Creek. Cora's neighbor, a steady, capable woman named Ruth Burkett, wife of the farmer whose cows had died in the ravine, stood with Cora. The minister performed the ceremony with the appropriate gravity, and then smiled wide enough to entirely undermine the gravity the moment it was done. They walked out of the church into the rain-washed March afternoon as husband and wife, and the gathered townspeople made enough noise to startle the horses at the hitching posts, and Cora turned her face up into the thin spring sunlight and thought she had never in her life felt more completely in the right place. The wedding supper was held in the church hall, organized by Mrs. Alcott and several other women of the town who had clearly been planning it for longer than strictly necessary given the short engagement, which suggested they had been certain of the outcome before the principals were. There was roast beef and ham and 6 different kinds of pie, and fiddle music, and dancing on the plank floor until the light was gone outside, and the lamps were lit inside, and the celebration had taken on the warm, enclosed quality of a room full of people who are all happy in the same moment. Joseph danced with her twice, which was the maximum that dignity permitted him, and both times he danced with the careful attention of a man who takes the things he does seriously, even the things that are supposed to be easy, and she found this entirely in keeping with everything she had come to know about him. At the end of the evening he brought them both home, because it was their home now, both of theirs completely, and they stood on the covered porch in the March dark for a moment before going inside, looking out at the farm in the dark. The fields were brown and bare, waiting for spring planting. The barn was solid and still. The creek could be heard in the distance, running with the winter's last melt. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "He would have tested you first," she said. "He would have given you some difficult piece of work to do and watched how you did it without telling you what he was watching for." What would the test have been? She thought about it. He would have asked you to help him with something in the barn, she said. Nothing complicated, just something that required working alongside someone. He believed you could learn everything you needed to know about a man by working beside him for a few hours. And what would he have concluded? Joseph asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had not done before, not like this, not with the ease of a thing that was already habitual. That you were worth keeping, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and they stood in the dark and looked at their farm, and that was the beginning of the life they were going to live. Spring came, and with it the planting, and the farm work multiplied into the particular glorious chaos of planting season. They worked side by side with the systematic thoroughness of two people who were both fundamentally incapable of doing a thing halfway, and the 40 acres took on the planted and tended look that had always been the Yates farm's best quality, the particular look of land that is being properly cared for by people who intend to stay. Joseph's work as a deputy continued, and the dynamics of that work had shifted with Hatch's removal from the scene. There were still the ordinary requirements of law enforcement in a territory that was still in the process of becoming fully organized cattle disputes, the occasional fight at the saloon, the slow grinding work of establishing reliable legal procedure in a place where legal procedure was still sometimes contested. But the particular pressure of Hatch's campaign against the smaller landowners was gone, and several of those landowners, emboldened by the outcome, had begun to speak more openly about organizing a proper land association to protect their collective interests, which was the kind of development that Joseph found genuinely encouraging. He came home in the evenings to the farm, and she had supper ready or nearly ready, and they ate at the table her father had made from local timber in 1872, and they talked about what they had each done that day, with the natural ease of people who have found the specific other person with whom easy conversation is not something that requires effort. In April, Gerald Hatch was convicted in the territorial court on 2 of the 4 charges against him: the bank collusion and 1 count of fraudulent mortgage acceleration, the latter being specifically regarding the Yates farm's false default declaration. He was fined substantially and stripped of his rights to hold banking instruments in the territory for 10 years, which effectively ended his capacity to continue his land acquisition campaign. He sold 3 of his existing properties to cover his legal costs and fines and retreated to Tucson, where he apparently still had connections, and Redemption Creek was, in the unanimous opinion of its residents, considerably better off for his absence. Aldridge, the former bank manager, received his own separate accounting, a fine and a 3-year prohibition on financial employment in the territory. Collins at the bank turned out to be both competent and honest, which was a combination the town had perhaps not fully appreciated having until they'd gone a period without it. It was in May that Cora told Joseph she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch in the warm spring dark, and she said it directly because she had long since concluded that directness was the mode of communication that worked best between them, and also the only one she was any good at. He was still for a moment, and she watched his face in the gathering dark, and she saw something move through him, something large and quiet and not altogether composed, and then he turned to look at her and his eyes were very bright. "When?" he said. "November, the doctor thinks," she said. "I went to see him Monday." He reached over and took her hand, and then he pulled her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, which was not a gesture she had seen him make before, and it undid her so completely that she had to look away at the dark fields for a moment. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Some," he said. "Yes." "Good," she said. "I'd be worried about you if you weren't." He laughed, that surprised, genuine laugh that was one of her favorite things, and she laughed too, and the spring night was warm around them and the farm was green and growing in the dark, and they sat together on the porch until the stars were fully out. The summer was full and demanding and good. The corn came up well, and the wheat was the best Cora had managed since before her father's death. She knew what he had done, and she knew how to replicate it, and Joseph had added his own observations and suggestions that had, after some discussion, proven largely correct. They argued about irrigation timing one afternoon in August with the focused intensity of two people who both know a great deal about what they're arguing over, and at the end of it arrived at a compromise position that turned out to produce better results than either of their original positions would have, which was a satisfying outcome even though she would not have admitted it quite as readily as he did. Ruth Burkett and several other women of the town came to the farm regularly through the summer, with the specific combination of practical assistance and cheerful sociability that was the community's way of caring for one of their own. Cora accepted the help with the grace she had gradually learned to extend toward things offered without conditions, which had required some adjustment of deeply held principles, but had eventually been accomplished. Joseph had gone through his own adjustment, which was the recognition that loving someone means accepting their worry as well as their help, and that Cora worrying about him when his work put him in difficult situations was not something to be minimized but something to be acknowledged and honored. He had told her about a confrontation with a horse thief on the southern road one September afternoon, and he had told her plainly, including the part where the situation had been genuinely dangerous for a few minutes, because she had told him once that she would rather have difficult truths than comfortable omissions, and he had believed her. She had listened to the whole account and had been very still for a moment and had then said, "Thank you for telling me," and had held his hand very tightly for a while, and that had been all. He had found that sufficient, more than sufficient, actually. He had found it exactly what he needed, which was the truth of her reaction without the pretense that she had no reaction at all. November arrived. The harvest was in, the cellars were full, the farm was as prepared for winter as it could be. On the 14th of November, a cold and brilliantly clear Sunday, Cora's labor began, and by the following morning they had a son. He was born at 3 in the morning, into the hands of the midwife Mrs. Pryor, with Joseph waiting in the kitchen with the patience of a man who was finding patience his most difficult ever application. When Mrs. Pryor opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he moved through that doorway with a speed that was entirely inconsistent with his usual deliberate manner, and found Cora sitting up against the pillows holding a small wrapped bundle and looking at it with the expression of someone who has encountered something beyond their previous categories of experience. She looked up when he came in, and her face was exhausted and radiant and utterly herself, and she said, "Come and look." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face of his son, which was red and furious-looking in the manner of newborns, and felt something change in him that he suspected was permanent. "What do we call him?" Cora asked. "Franklin," Joseph said without hesitation. She looked at him. Her eyes filled quickly and without her permission, and she blinked the tears away with the same efficiency she applied to everything and said, "Yes, Franklin." They called him Frank almost immediately, because Franklin was a large name for a very small person, though he grew into it with the speed that babies apply to the project of becoming themselves. The first year of Frank's life was the usual combination of wonder and exhaustion that parenthood produces, and they navigated it with the same practical determination they applied to everything. Joseph had a particular gift for the early hours, having spent enough years sleeping lightly in a law enforcement capacity that the interrupted nights bothered him less than they bothered Cora, and he took the before-dawn shift with a matter-of-fact willingness that she found extraordinarily attractive and told him so, which made him laugh quietly in the dark so as not to wake the baby. Frank grew, as children do, with the inevitability and the perpetual surprise of something living. He had Joseph's dark eyes and Cora's chin and his grandfather Franklin's laugh, which Cora recognized with a sharpness that was both painful and beautiful, the way all the best grief eventually becomes. The Hatch case concluded its final administrative stages in the spring following Frank's birth, with the last of the property-related legal matters resolved and the records corrected. Joseph received a formal commendation from the Territorial Marshal's office for his work in building the case that had led to Hatch's conviction, which he acknowledged with the brevity of a man who is satisfied with the outcome and has no particular need for credit. Sheriff Alcott had been talking for some time about the fact that he was not going to be doing this job forever, and that when he was ready to step back, he could think of no one he would more confidently recommend for the sheriff's position than his deputy. Joseph had listened to this with the measured consideration he gave to significant things, and had discussed it with Cora one evening in the spring while Frank slept and the farm breathed around them. "Is it what you want?" she asked. "It's more responsibility," he said, "more complicated, more of everything." "That wasn't what I asked," she said. He thought about it properly. "Yes," he said, "it's what I want, not for the title. For the capacity to do more of what I've been doing." "Then you should do it," she said, "when the time comes. You'd be a good sheriff's wife," he said, and there was the slight suggestion of mischief in his voice that she had come to love. "I'm already an excellent deputy's wife," she said. "I expect the additional status will come naturally." He smiled. Frank made a sound from his cradle and they both looked, and it was nothing. He was still sleeping, and they looked back at each other in the lamplight of the farmhouse that had been Franklin Yates and was now theirs. And the smile between them was the kind that contains a whole life's worth of knowing, the kind that does not need to be explained, because both people already understand every part of it. The following years accumulated with the easy momentum of a life that is fundamentally right. Frank learned to walk at 13 months and immediately applied this ability to reach as many things as possible that were not intended for him, which was a character note of considerable consistency in subsequent years. He was bright and curious and stubborn, all three qualities in generous measure, which Cora recognized as heritable and Joseph observed with a private amusement he kept mostly to himself. The farm expanded. They added a kitchen garden of sufficient size to supply them through winter, without depending on the dry goods store for anything beyond necessities. Joseph built a proper storage cellar in the fall of 1885, spending 6 consecutive weekends on it with the thoroughness he brought to all physical tasks, and the result was a structure so solid and well-organized that Ruth Burkett came to look at it, and then went home and told her husband Elias he needed to build her one exactly like it, which he eventually did. There was a second child, a daughter, born in the summer of 1886, whom they called Margaret after Joseph's mother, who was still alive in Missouri and wrote letters in the irregular but enthusiastic manner of a woman who had many grandchildren, but was giving special attention to the ones she hadn't yet met. They called the child Maggie, and she arrived in the world with an expression of utter serenity that was entirely unlike Frank's newborn fury, and suggested she had already decided to be a different kind of person from her brother, a promise she kept faithfully. Alcott retired in the spring of 1887, and the county commissioners, after a process that was a formality because there was only one person anyone seriously proposed, appointed Joseph Donnelly as sheriff. He received his new star with the same composed manner he had brought to everything and pinned it on, and went back to work. Cora made a supper to celebrate. She made her mother's biscuits and roasted a chicken from their own yard and put out the blue-edged china plates that had been her mother's good china, the same plates she had used the first night Joseph came to dinner in the farmhouse, the night everything important had begun to be said. Joseph noticed the plates. She could tell by the slight smile that moved through his face when he sat down, and he did not remark on it, and neither did she. But the acknowledgment was there between them, quiet and certain. Frank, who was 3, ate with the focused intensity of a small person who has not yet learned that eating is not the main event, and Maggie sat in her high chair and regarded the proceedings with her characteristic serenity. And the farmhouse kitchen was warm with the smell of food and wood smoke, and the accumulated presence of a family that had been built on hard ground and had taken firm and permanent root. After the children were in bed, Cora and Joseph sat on the covered porch in the April evening, the same porch where she had watched him walk away in the dark months before they had found the words for any of this. And the night was mild, and the fields were showing the first green of spring planting, and the creek murmured in the distance with the patient sound of water that has been going about its business for a very long time. "How does it feel?" she asked. "The new position." "The same work," he said, "with more paperwork and a slightly better view of the whole county. Is that satisfying?" "Very," he said. He paused. "When I came to Arizona, I didn't know what I was looking for." "I told you that, I think." "You told me you were looking for something worth staying for," she said. "And somewhere I could do the work the right way," he said. "Both things." He looked out at the dark farm, the fields, the barn, the road that ran past and connected them to Redemption Creek and through it to everything beyond. "I found more than I was looking for." She took his hand on the porch rail between them. His grip was warm and immediate and entirely certain, the way it had been the first time he had taken her hand across the kitchen table on the night they had signed the loan agreement in a different version of a life that had since become this one, broader and fuller and more irreplaceable than anything she could have planned for. "Joseph," she said. "Yes." "My father's farm is in very good hands," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the door she could see everything she needed to see: the steadiness, the warmth, the humor that lived just behind the solemnity, and the particular way he looked at her that was not like the way he looked at anything else. "Our farm," he said. "Our farm," she agreed, and the night was warm around them and the spring was coming in and the farm was green and growing in the dark. And Cora Yates Donnelly sat on her porch with her husband and thought that this was what it felt like when a secret they've been keeping from you all your life finally reveals itself. When the thing you were always going to have finds its way to you through the particular and improbable and perfect path that was the only way it was ever going to arrive. The stars came out one by one over Redemption Creek, and the farm was quiet, and they stayed on the porch until the night turned cold, and then they went inside and they were home. Years later, when Frank was grown and had come back from 2 years studying law in Tucson, with the same stubborn purposefulness that ran through both sides of his inheritance, and Maggie had taken up the farm work with an aptitude that would have made her grandfather Franklin proud, and Joseph had retired from the sheriff's position after a decade of service that had transformed Redemption Creek from a contested frontier outpost to a properly organized and genuinely just community. They would sit on the same covered porch, and the same creek would murmur in the distance, and the same stars would come out over the same fields, now worked by the next generation, and they would be the elderly couple that younger people looked at and thought, "That is what it looks like when something is built to last." Joseph would take her hand on the porch rail and she would hold it back, and the whole history of them would be there in that gesture. The auction block, and the seized gavel, and the crowd in the dusty square, and the formal paperwork, and the earnest cornbread, and the Sunday declaration on the front path, and the ceremony in the rain-washed March sunlight, and every ordinary, extraordinary day of the life that had followed. And none of it would need to be said because both of them already carried it, complete and vivid and theirs. This was what he had bought with $400 and the willingness to stand in a public square and say plainly what he meant. Not just a farm, not just a future, something that had no price anyone had ever accurately quoted. And this was what she had built on her father's land and her mother's determination, and her own unyielding refusal to let fear do her thinking for her. A life that was wide enough to hold all of it, the grief and the joy and the work and the love and the small daily miracles of two people who chose each other, over and over, in every ordinary moment of an extraordinary life. The farm was real and solid under the stars. The creek ran on. The next morning would come with its work and its ordinary demands and its particular beauty, and they would meet it together, as they had met every morning for all the years of their life together, as they fully intended to meet every morning that remained. There was nothing left unresolved. There was no hidden motive that had not been examined, no dark past that had not been acknowledged and set in its proper place, no forced choice that had not been made freely and with full understanding, no secret that the years had not gently and completely brought to light. There was only this: the farm, the family, the marriage, the long and well-made life. And that, in every way that mattered, was more than enough.